As dessert and coffee is being served, we want to continue with the program, and it's my privilege to moderate this keynote panel on the one topic that, no matter who you are or where you are, comes up and will continue to come up in every conversation just about until November, and that's the U.S. elections. We don't know how any of it will turn out, of course, once the dust has cleared, but one thing we do know is that whoever is elected, and whatever the shape of the Congress is, it will have a profound impact on the issues that affect our hemisphere. So we need to have a solid understanding of the key issues and the directions and, of course, the possible outcomes. Ladies and gentlemen, our two speakers are top of the top. They really are. They've forgotten more about U.S. politics than most of us will ever know. Their bios, in case you haven't had a chance to look at them, are in the book that you have at your table, so I won't go into that. I'd rather spend time talking with them instead of introducing them. But they're campaign organizers and leaders, political consultants, crisis managers. Doug and Russ, our two speakers, have literally done it all, and we're thrilled to have them join us for the lunch today. Would you please join me in welcoming to the Council of the Americas our two terrific speakers, Doug and Russ. So let's just get things started with a very general question and give both of you a chance to weigh in here. How do you see the November elections? Do you think it's going to be essentially a rematch of 2020 with the two leading candidates, or is it something different if you follow social media like the apocalypse? Is it going to be something dramatically different or much of the same? Doug, how about you?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. 8 years ago, Russ and I did one of these speeches right before the election, which hopefully Russ doesn't remember. I spent quite a bit of time explaining how there's not a way in the world Donald Trump would ever be elected president. So I'm still living that down. But I'm telling you that story for two reasons. One is just to get it off my chest. But the other is I got a tremendous amount of respect for what was going on that elected Donald Trump president. And I didn't underestimate his ability to get reelected in 2020. Despite the fact that the polls all said he was going to lose, and he almost won. And I guess, so my short answer to his question is I have no idea what's going to happen in the election. I learned my lesson from 2016. But there's one thing I do want to leave you with. If there's nothing else, it's this. You should view Donald Trump as a symptom of what's going on in America, not the cause. And 100 years from now, when the people look back at this period of time, they're not going to be talking about Donald Trump and his trials and his this and that. They're going to try to understand what was going on in America that led for someone like Donald Trump to become president. And that phenomenon is going to continue whether Trump wins or loses in November, and at some point whenever he's no longer on the political scene. And really quickly, my short answer to what happened here was two things. One is the decline of the American middle class that began in the early 1970s, and the other was the alienation that Americans feel towards institutions in this country. They think institutions in this country are either broken or they're corrupt. And this is what's led to a lot of people in America voting for Trump. And regardless of the outcome of the election, these divisions in our country that are largely driven by education levels are going to continue well into this decade.
Russ?
Well, I agree a lot of what Doug said, and I think that anybody that tells you they know what's going to happen is, has some kind of crystal ball that I don't have access to. But we do know this, is that this is going to be it's going to be close because the last several elections have been close. It's going to be down to, as Doug points out in this great memo that he writes, it's going to come down to 7 states probably, right? And in those 7 states, the margins are even going to be closer. So you're going to see this campaign over the next 6 months being played out in those states. Now, I mentioned earlier, I have never gone into a presidential election where there have been so many unknowns, where there have been things that could happen over the next 6 months that could radically change the game or not change it at all, and we might think it would. I mean, if we ever thought that, as we sit here today having this great lunch in this beautiful room, that the Republican nominee, the former president of the United States, would be sitting on trial in New York for a felony, and a former porn star would be testifying against him, that we would say, you got to be kidding me. That's fiction. That's sort of, some kind of weird fictional occurrence. But it's happening. And how is that going to impact the race? Does he get convicted? Anything that could happen with, with foreign policy, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Ukraine, could dramatically change the fortunes, particularly of President Biden. So, we have 6 months. I think we're just going to, you just have to kind of, buckle up, and it'll be a bumpy ride.
What do you think could be some of those things, Russ, continuing with you, that would be those black swan events? And would that mean people are voting for a candidate or voting against a candidate?
I guess it would depend upon the what kind of black swan event it was, and how it kind of played itself out. I think that in some ways the incumbent is always more problematic with these types of events, because they actually have to do it and manage it. Now, the upside is always great, because if you do it successfully and it's seen as success, you can have a bump in your approval rating, and that could sustain you for a while. But there's a lot of things on the horizon that could provide as potential problems for an incumbent president. And so I would lean toward those so-called black swan events actually benefiting the challenger in this case.
Doug, separate and apart from black swan, what are some of the trends that you've been seeing in this election cycle so far? What's driving the vote? What are the two campaigns looking for? Who are they trying to convince? Who's up for grabs?
So I don't think there'll be a black swan event. I think there used to be a saying in America, all politics is local. The way you get elected is tailor your message and your focus to your local constituents and things they care about. That's no longer true. Now all politics is national. The single most important thing to know about how a community is going to vote is the level of education. People are clustering and living around people who share their values and their backgrounds. And so 45 out of 50 states voted for the same candidate for president, same party in the last two elections. 95 out of 100 United States senators are of the same party as the candidate who carried their state in 2020. There are only 22 members of the House out of 435 members of the House that are of a different party than the candidate who carried their state or their district in the last election. So if I know the education levels of a community, I can tell you how they're going to vote. And that, more than any black swan event or any event going on. I mean, look, the dirty little secret is Trump hasn't campaigned in a year and a half. He hardly does anything. And Biden has, I would say less of a full schedule than many other presidents. And part of it is it doesn't matter, because the structure of our country, the divisions in our country, which is basically divided by the winners and the losers, far outrides any event, a trial in New York, you name it. And that's at the core what's driving our politics, and that's what's going to determine the outcome in November. There are 7 states, as Russ mentioned, probably 3 or 4 actually within that are going to decide the election. It's less than 15% of the United States population. What makes every one of these states except one the same is they're at the middle level of education levels. That's why they're swing states. If states have a high disproportionate number of college graduates, they're for Democrats. States with a high percentage of non-college voters, they're Republican. So the battleground now is in these small handful of states that don't skew towards either highly educated or less educated voters.
Would you say, Doug, that is consistent then in terms of, I mean, as politics has become increasingly atomized, where does, for example, the Hispanic community fit into that, or the youth vote that President Biden seems to be going after?
So when I started out in politics 100 years ago, they talked about the Italian vote, and the Irish vote, and the Hispanic vote. And I mean, by the way, the Hispanic vote, is that ridiculous? You got Cubans, you got Venezuelans, you got Puerto Ricans, you got Mexicans. You lump them all together as if they think the same. But starting out in our country, when people move over here, they identify with where they came from. But increasingly, as people assimilate in America, they think of themselves much more not where they came from, but who they are and their stations in life. And so what's happening now is these education levels are such a stronger driver in how people are going to vote, regardless of their race or ethnicity. And that's why the Republicans in general, and Trump in particular, has made tremendous headways with Hispanic voters, particularly younger Hispanic voters, particularly non-college Hispanic voters, and particularly male Hispanic voters. And so what you're going to see increasingly are voting patterns that transcend, as I say, race and ethnicity.
Russ, from the Republican side, does that ring true with you as well, or do you see things a little bit differently?
No, I think it rings absolutely true, and I think you've seen the Republicans trying to get more and more of the Hispanic vote and more of the black vote, and this was always sort of both of those were sort of a goal that we'd always try. We'd sit in a room, and say, okay, we need to get a higher percentage of the black vote this year, and we'd all sit around and try to figure out how to do it, and it would never happen.
That's a bunch of old white guys sitting around talking about how to get black vote.
Exactly, and so, but this time I think there's some real opportunities, and I've seen that just in a couple of states that I've been working in where you talk to black voters and they're much more open to voting for a Republican candidate, particularly a Republican candidate who kind of gets them. And I think to some degree, as much as a lot of people roll their eyes at Donald Trump, particularly in the kind of educated classes, there's a lot of people who kind of think Trump gets me. And Trump gets me in a way that no other politician has before. And I think that's the case where you can get a higher percentage of both the black vote and a higher percentage of an Hispanic vote.
Let's shift the gaze a little bit from politics to policy. If President Trump is reelected, and neither of you, as I understand, is affiliated with the campaign, so we're talking independently here, but Russ, to the extent President Trump were reelected or elected to a second term, what would you anticipate his policy drivers would be? Do you see a similar approach to 2016, or would this be different?
Yeah, I think he'll do is a lot of the things he did in the first term, but I think he's going to do them, kind of on steroids. I think the object will be is I have 4 years. There's a lot that I want to get done. I know how to do this now. I know what the levers of power are. I know what I can do and I can't do. I know how to staff an administration with people that are not going to slow walk my agenda. And so I think you'll see but whether it's on trade or immigration or some cultural issues, the president is going to be pushing pretty hard to do as many things as he can, as quickly as he can, and a lot of them, and as much of them as he can by executive order. Let's see what happens with the House and the Senate. That depending upon how that goes, you can actually see that even expanding.
If I could just, I agree with that. I want to say something nice about Trump, and I'll be really brief. In 2015, when he rode down that escalator announcing he was going to run for president, first of all, those were unemployed actors that he hired to hold signs. When he rolled down that escalator, he did not have a clue what he was doing. He ran that campaign without a clue of how you do politics. There was no one who ever got elected president who owed fewer people than Donald Trump. He did the whole thing on his own. There were not fundraisers and bundlers that he owed. There wasn't a campaign staff that he owned. He did the whole thing. Then he went in the White House, and he didn't have a clue what he was doing. And he was bouncing around for 4 years. He almost actually won in spite of himself. But he's a smart, quick learner. And he has a very sophisticated campaign that he's running now. They mostly have him on his meds when there's not a trial. But if he wins, he knows exactly what he's going to do for a second time. And I would say steroids is a kind way of putting it. He's going to go in there and he's going to dismantle the deep state. He is going to first, second, third, and fourth priorities is going to be people who are loyal to him and are going to execute what he wants. And he'd rather have an empty chair in an office than that. He's going to dismantle the civil service, and he's going to go all in, and he's going to be a lot wiser and far more effective in pursuing what he's what he wants to do than he ever did in his first 4 years.
What you're describing is honestly what we see a lot in Latin America sometimes with, weak institutions and the inability to push back from strong executives and things like that. What about, we've mentioned the Congress a couple times. What about the courts? What about the Congress? Are there guardrails here, or do you think that this is going to be something that won't matter that much?
It depends, right? It depends upon what the Senate looks like. I think the conventional wisdom is that Republicans pick up the Senate. It's kind of hard. How do you see not? It's the number of Senate seats that are being contested that have Democrat incumbents on them. The Democrats would have to basically have an inside straight, assuming West Virginia is gone already. And then there's an assumption that the House will probably slip over to the Democrats. I want to pick up on something that Doug said in terms of the number of swing seats. Back when we started in politics, there was about 150 swing seats, 150 seats where they voted one way for Republican, they voted a different way for Congress. Today, there's about 20, 22. And so we've shrunken the playing field to so small so that when you look at these swing seats that are up in this election, they do tend to lean towards the Democrats. So I think that's the most likely probability of an outcome. And a lot of that will depend upon what happens with the court and what happens with a lot of appointments. If Trump can't just, push things through kind of by either sheer force of will and power.
So if I could just quickly, a couple things on that. So if you want to understand what's wrong with American politics, why everyone claims they're moderates and they have all these crazy lefties and crazy righties running our government, how can we have that? The problem in our politics today is we have the wrong reward system. Because of the way people are self-selecting where they live, to Russ's point, the 93% of the members of the House who don't have competitive seats, they're far more vulnerable to losing a primary than they are a general election. So the reward system, if you want to keep your job, is to go to the left if you're in a blue district and go to the right if you're in a Republican district. I just want to mention there are two words that just came up that really I think are important. One is guardrails. The guardrails held in 2020, they largely held because of two groups. They largely held because of the courts. Several of the judges were Trump appointed. And the guardrails held in the states because of Republicans, Republican elected officials in Georgia and Arizona. That's why the guardrails held. The other thing, the word you used, which I think is really incredibly important word to understand what's going on with the Trump campaign, is you use the term strongman. If there was a single word to describe Donald Trump's view of life, Donald Trump's campaign, it's strong. And if there's a single word that I could use for Trump to describe Biden, it's weak. And you all, from where you come from, I think you might say it's certainly true in Europe and other places. The more chaos people feel, the more instability that people feel, the more they're looking for strength. And so this is the essence of Trump's campaign. And so just quickly on Gaza, I have no idea if Gaza is going to impact the election with this net. I can tell you right now, though, that Gaza reinforces the negative narrative of Bush being weak and chaos in the world, even though I'm sure Biden, but Biden, Biden's president, so he's stuck with these problems. I'm not even sure there's a solution to these problems, but he's president of the United States, for better or for worse. And so when you have an intractable problem like this and you're the chief executive like Biden is, this is not a great place to be, particularly if it feeds into Trump's narrative about why you should vote for him and not Biden.
We have only about 10 minutes left. We've already used up a big chunk of time, and we've still got a bunch of things to get to. But one of the things I want to make sure we ask is, we've talked a little bit about what Trump might look like, but let's not assume that Trump is going to be elected. President Biden could certainly be reelected if he is. Doug, what do you think his second-term agenda might look like? Second terms always shift a little bit from the first, no?
Right. Well, he's really accomplished an incredible amount, and in many ways, I think Biden is going to stand. They say when you're a president of the United States, you have to be out of office for 40 years. before you can write the first draft of history of like how significant you were. And these things get rewritten. You know, Truman was supposed to be a horrible president, but somewhere about year 35, all of a sudden he became a good president. So I'm in many ways, I'm quite confident of 40 years from now, how history is going to treat Biden and what he accomplished. It's harder, though, in the short term for people to feel the impact of that because of how big the things were that Biden attacked and is trying to deal with, these huge long-term game-shifting changes like on energy and other policies. So if Biden is to get reelected, I think it will be all hands on deck to continue to accelerate what he accomplished in the first term and really tried to harden the silos of making that permanent. So when Obama got reelected in 2012, I mean, what he was able to do was just was to make it even harder and harder for the Republicans to undo Obamacare. So I think in most 8-year presidencies, there are a couple of things about 8-year presidencies. First of all, almost never is the second term very good. And secondly, most of what a president accomplishes in 8 years was done in their first term. But the unique nature of what Biden has done in this first term, which I think is historic, a second term will be to try to push to fruition those efforts in a way that regardless who would be replacing him in 2029, they can't undo what he's accomplished in 8 years.
Yeah, just to point out, I agree with that, and exactly the first 4 year, the second 4 years, it's about making sure that the stuff that you did in the first 4 years sticks, and that you're going to continue to kind of do it and solidify those policies. It is too easy to undo a lot of things only in 4 years. You kind of just, kind of push back, kind of undo it, staff goes away. And so I think that if you're Biden, you want to make sure that you're going to continue to kind of make sure your legacy is those things you did in the first 4 years. And then I would also think that most presidents in a second term, not that he hasn't done this in the first, but foreign policy takes a really big front seat.
Let's pick up on that point. Admittedly, Latin America and the Caribbean is not the priority for this campaign. The issues are not, but there are at least two issues that are prominent in the campaign that directly impact the region, and other people could come up with other examples as well. But two I want to explicitly ask are migration and trade.
Right.
So I wonder, Russ, if you could talk to us, and then Doug, about how you see these issues playing in the campaign, and based on that, what mandate, if any, the president who's elected will have in the next 4 years.
Well, we've seen what President Trump's position on trade has been. He's, skeptical at best. So I think, the deals will be, if he'll want to negotiate deals that he will believe are one-sided and good for him and good for the, for Trump, but not necessarily both ways. Now, I think that's to be seen, because I think sometimes if Trump negotiates it, it's a good treaty. If somebody else negotiates it, it's a bad treaty. So I think we've seen that in the past. I think the bigger one that's going to impact the election, though, more is migration. And I think that what is going on at the southern border, where you see more and more, people coming in, you're seeing a lot of news media coverage. You're seeing that the migration is coming not just from Central and Latin America, but from other countries as well, but using that as a conduit, has all become part of the conversation, that when you talk to voters in focus groups and you talk to voters in polls, migration is generally the first or the second thing that they're talking about. And, again, the Biden administration is sort of on their heels a little bit with this question, because the solutions are hard, they're difficult, and they're going to take a while to implement. And it's going to be, and the Trump is a lot easier to kind of point the finger over the next 6 months as to what is happening.
So I agree. So on trade, all Trump cares about is being able to be perceived that he won on the negotiations. I don't even think he'd read what it was. And, he did all this stuff with China and all these tariffs. They didn't even comply with half of what the deal was cut. And Trump doesn't care. He moved on. I think for Trump, the most important thing is going to be who is staffing him. and driving that policy. And if Lightenhauser is the guy, which I think he probably will be, then you're going to see a sharply different view on trade, and even than Trump in the first 4 years. On immigration, first of all, it's a problem that has been sitting around for 40 years and hasn't been fixed. And there's a reason it hasn't been fixed, is that there's not an easy way to fix it. And it's gotten a lot worse. And it is the first or second most important issue for the American voters right now. It is, I agree with what Russ said, it is both an issue that people care about, but it's also a proxy for other issues that people care about, and they just house it with immigration. But the politics has changed, and I don't think the Democrats are sensitive enough to it. I mean, there are a lot of Democratic governors and Democratic mayors who are as concerned about the flow of people into this country just as much as Southern Republican governors right now. You know, when Trump was president, you couldn't get 40% of Americans in polling to say they supported the wall. Now over half the country supports the building of the wall. So the politics has changed significantly. And if Biden were to lose in November, I would say the two reasons are going to be inflation and this issue.
I would just add the other interesting point about that is when you talk about a lot of the quote Hispanic vote, you talk to Hispanics who came to this country legally, or any immigrant who came here legally, they have a much, much different opinion on the issue of immigration than those who hadn't.
And it's a Democrat. We have a few problems in our party. At least we don't have Trump. But we have a bunch of educated liberals who have a disproportionate impact on the policies of the Democratic Party, who all live on the coast or in urban areas or the Acela corridor, and they are out of touch with a lot of America. And you know, for them to think that somehow, oh, if you're Hispanic, then you're for our position, it completely misreads the community, which is pretty culturally conservative, by the way, and is moving, as Russ had mentioned, in very measurable ways towards the Republican Party.
In the time remaining, let's ask one final question. The elections are November 5th. What do you think the country looks like on November 6th? Russ?
Unhappy. But seriously, it looks unhappy. I mean, I think that you're going to see, and Doug will remember this, and many of you will. In 2008, when Obama was elected, I think that there was a lot of people from both sides who felt a sense of optimism. I really did. I mean, not all Republicans, but there was a chunk of Republicans who felt a sense of optimism. I think that they felt that in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. I mean, there are those moments when that does happen. I think this is going to be the opposite of that. I think you're going to see whoever side lost is going to be miserable. The campaign is going to start immediately. The recriminations, the finger pointing, the retribution is all going to start. This is not a very positive, uplifting look at where America is going to be. But I think it's the way it's going to happen until something happens that we get beyond this. But until then, I think we're just going to see everyone's going to back into their corners and the fight's going to start all over again.
So I agree. I'm going to build on that quickly and then give you one what to watch tip from what guys like me and him do for a living. So first of all, regardless of who's in power, our country has, for over 20 years now, majority of Americans have said the country is headed in the wrong direction. They don't care who's in power. In 10 out of the last 12 elections, the country's voted against and changed either the president and or the House and the Senate. So we're in an extended period of people feeling alienated towards their government, how they feel about their lives. And we're going to, at the end of this election, we'll be more divided as a country than we are now. And it's interesting, when Jake was speaking, he talked about the challenges of democracy. And I was thinking, oh, that's great. In the United States, we've signed up for that. And I think that people are underestimating, we're talking at lunch, I think people are underestimating the day after the election, what's going to happen. And I think that, first of all, it's quite possible we're not going to know who won for a while. And secondly, at least one of the candidates, one of the candidates has said they aren't necessarily going to honor the results. So I do worry, and we went through this in 2020, but I think what we're facing after this election could be more challenging. So I really do worry about that. The quick tease that I'll say is, the bad news is I think we're going to continue this period for probably at least the rest of this decade. I do think we're going to come out of it. And the way we're going to come out of it is when basically all the baby boomers die and the Gen Z and millennial generations take over power because they think we're all crazy. They think the Democrats suck. They think the Republicans suck. And there's much more of a communitarian sense about the future. And when they do take over, we're going to get out of this, but I don't think it's imminent. The last thing I'll say, I don't know if you agree with this because this is what you do for a living. In our business, the person that defines what this campaign is about wins. That's why people pay them millions of dollars to do TV ads. So if this election, so at the end of the campaign, if I know what this, you're not disputing that.
No, I wish.
So if I come down from Mars at the end of October and I see that this is an election, a referendum on the Biden presidency, he's going to lose. Unless the polls change, if this election is about who was a better president, Biden or Trump, Biden's going to lose. If this is an election about the future based on the past, then I think it's 50-50. And if this is an election about Donald Trump, then Biden's going to win. Every indice from when guys like Russ and I started, every metric historically would say Biden's going to lose, which is job approval, direction of the country, positions on issues. However, so that's from historical standards. However, in the last three election cycles, starting in 2018, 2020, 2022, every one of those elections has been about Donald Trump. And in every single one of those elections, the Republicans got slaughtered. So really, at the end of the day, that's the single most important thing to focus on is what is this elections about? If I know that, I'll tell you who's going to win.
No, I agree. I totally agree. And I think you've seen that in a lot of some local elections, even this year, some state Senate races and some local races where Democrats have kind of outperformed because the race was a referendum on Trump. And there's a lot of things we didn't get into, which I also think, just very quickly, one question that I've been asking on all my surveys is dividing sort of the world into two buckets. And what is more important to determining your vote? Is it immigration, crime, in the economy, or protecting women's reproductive rights, protecting democracy, and defeating Donald Trump? And what I'm looking for is where's the energy in those between those two kind of buckets of issues. And what I've seen is that it's very, very close. And I think that if you start to look at where the energy lies, then you can kind of start predicting where the vote's going to be. And we're probably about 3-4 months away from that.
Regrettably, we are at the limits of our time available, and so we're going to have to call this conversation to a conclusion. One quick note before we do conclude. For those who are joining our meetings this afternoon at about 2 o'clock, if you could just gather over here by this side of the stage with Moises Rendon, who is the gentleman who has just walked over there, but we have a few minutes before we need to collect. Ladies and gentlemen, now you know I was so excited to host this conversation. This was fascinating. It really was. And there's so much you've given us to think about, contemplate, look for, look back on. And I trust and hope that all of us have learned a great deal from this conversation. Would you please join me in thanking Russ Schriefer and Doug Sosnik for their terrific comments today?
Thank you.
This will conclude our lunch. Thank you for coming. Hope to see you all tomorrow.